Randall Kenan, author of Walking on Water. What's your book about?
Well, it's a travel narrative about what it means to be black in America. I sort of set out to travel all over North America, traveling on a theme. And the theme was to ask the question, what does it mean at the end of the 20th century to be black?
Where's this cover picture taken?
I don't know. That's one of the reasons we chose it. It sort of looks like Every Town America.
When did you start your travels?
I started in 1991. Beginning in New England and traveling north and west, going to places like Alaska, coming back around down into Utah and Louisiana.
Why did you want to do this?
Well, I found myself very perturbed and frustrated with what I perceived at the time to be the definition of black in America. A lot of the stereotypes I was seeing in the news media, magazines, television shows, just seemed to be very limiting. Plus, I was very worried about perceptions a lot of young folk were having about the limitations on what their own identity meant. And there were certain insecurities on my own part. Within certain segments of the African-American community, there can be certain attitudes that somebody is blacker than another person, and this blacker than thou attitude. And I found that, again, baseless. And I really wanted to apply geography to the question in a way that I hadn't seen done a great deal.
How many towns did you stop in that you write about in your book?
I think ultimately there are about 23 included, but I went to probably a score more.
At some point you say you had 5,000 pages of material.
Yeah, notes, transcripts, bits of history that I had collected over, it was about, we're talking 6 years worth of research and travel.
How many miles did you drive?
Well, at one point I had collected on my truck 75,000 miles. And this was having driven to Alaska and back and gone across the country twice. What
kind of a vehicle did you drive around in?
It was a Chevy Blazer, 1991 Chevy Blazer.
By yourself?
Yes, largely by myself.
How long would you stay in any one place?
I think the max was a little over 2 weeks. I tried not to upset the rhythm. At one point I was on the road for a total of 7 months. And at the end of 7 months, I realized that I was probably best to take a break.
How did you support yourself?
Well, I was lucky. I had an advance from my publisher, Knopf, and at that point, things were a little dicey, but I was lucky enough, again, to get some grants and awards that kept me going.
What role did your friend Richard play?
Well, the book is dedicated to the late Reverend Richard Elias Wimberly III, who was a very dear friend and a classmate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And in many ways, he's sort of the spirit behind this book. We talked about this issue almost ceaselessly when we were freshmen and throughout our college. He was a history major. He went on to become a theologian and minister and prison chapel, actually. And this was very, on a metaphysical, philosophical level, he was very concerned about issues of identity and, this thing called race. What did it mean? How did it shape people's lives? And he was also very interested in geography. And so this was sort of my labor of love to him.
How big has race been in your life?
Well, insofar as it affects most black folk in this country. I mean, I talk about the idea that for most black people, I would venture to say everyone, there's a point at which you realize that you're black, that the veil is lifted, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, that when you're a little child, perhaps sometimes as late as a teenager, an event occurs, someone points you out, and there's no return insofar as that you realize you're the other. You might have discussions with parents or ministers or what have you, but you realize that you are politically branded. And some people respond positively to this. Some people run away from it. There's a phenomenon in the African-American community called passing, if you're light-skinned enough. But there's that event that I think all black folks share in this country.
And you went to a lot of places that, as you acknowledge in your book, don't have many black people.
Yes.
And You can tell us about some of those places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and places like that. But tell me what the most awkward moment you had being black and being in a place that was all white.
Excuse me. That would have had to have been in Saskatchewan, Maidstone, Saskatchewan. I'd read about the football player Reuben Mays and that he was descended from settlers out in Western Canada who'd come up when Canada opened up its western corridor to homesteaders, and that he'd grown up in a place called Maidstone. And I drove there. I was very happy and proud with myself to have, driven out these long endless stretches of the Canadian western wilderness, and I got to Maidstone, which is about 500 people, and I had a nice dinner and went to bed, got up bright and early in the morning, and I hadn't seen anyone black, so I sort of did the most logical thing. I sort of walked into the little library and sort of introduced myself to the librarian and sort of said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I'm looking for black folk," and she just sort of put her hands up to her face and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. All our Negroes moved away years ago."
And you said, as you wrote, Negroes.
Negroes. I don't know excuse me, where that pronunciation came from, but that's how she pronounced it. And I had discovered that, most of the homesteaders actually who came to that part of the country at the turn of the century had gone on. So these people were now living in, Vancouver and Calgary and North Battleford, where I actually found Reuben's father and spoke with him.
Now, Dora Grain is your first person in the book, if I remember correctly. And how did you pick her as to start this all off?
Well, I went to Martha's Vineyard, sort of wanting to investigate this old, fabled elite community of Oak Bluffs, and I was doing research in the library, and I found this article. Mrs. Grain had been a labor official for many years, and had retired there and raised her last child. And this article spoke of how she was sort of indignant that people assumed that she, a black woman living on Martha's Vineyard, lived in Oak Bluffs. Again, the sort of stereotype that we folk tend to bring to black folk, and they all live in a certain place and think a certain way. And she sort of shattered all the ideas that I'd come to this idyllic community assuming. So I'm very grateful for her. I mean, she challenged a lot of the ideas. I mean, this was the first person I interviewed that I brought along with me. So I was very grateful for that.
Who does live in Oak Bluffs?
Well, pretty much everyone. I mean, it has become much more democratized than people would think. People do live black folk do live all over the island. There is a core of people, old Bostonians, that the novelist Dorothy West writes about. But there's a new group of young professionals. I mean, hip-hop artists are buying homes there. People are living in Edgartown and all over.
Vernon Jordan has been in the news over the years as a resident, I believe, of Martha's Vineyard. Did you find him up there?
He wasn't there at the time, or I didn't run into him at the time.
What other kind of, there are a lot of well-known blacks that seem to go there a lot.
Yes, Susan DePass, the movie and recording industry executive. I heard a rumor that Spike Lee had a place there. Ed Brooks had lived there. I did remember running into the president of the Ford Foundation at the time. In Vineyard Haven. I mean, a great deal of very visible African-American leaders tend to summer there.
How did you pick your spots?
Well, it was a combination of historical curiosity, curiosity on my part as well, finding tidbits that I really wanted to research, and then serendipity. I mean, I was in California visiting some friends when I read this article on Allensworth, California, which I had never heard of, which was founded by Colonel Allensworth, again at the turn of the century, and was the only town incorporated by and for black folk out in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley. So there were a lot of places that I just sort of stumbled upon in my research.
What did you find there?
Well, I found that it had become a ghost town at this point, but due to the work of probably one man, a man named Ed Pope, who sort of grew up there as a child. I mean, even when it was desolate, who had worked for the state for a long time. It had become a state park, and they were rebuilding it, and people were sort of coming back, and it was very inspiring.
There's a place called Idlewild, Michigan.
Yes.
and it's 70 miles, you say, north of Grand Rapids.
Yes, Idlewild had been, again, a place built for blacks at about the turn of the century. One of the, I quote in the passage, W.E.B. Du Bois, waxing very lyrical about it. He owned property there. He didn't spend much time there. But by the 50s and late 60s, this resort became just sort of a high point on what they call the Chitlin circuit. I mean, any entertainer who was any entertainer showed up there, from Duke Ellington to Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, B.B. King, and on and on and on. And it sort of fell on hard times, and it still is a place where people go because it's a beautiful part of Michigan. But it's also the poorest county in the state of Michigan. And I went there and talked to some of its residents, and I remember particularly this beautiful elderly woman named Trixie Griffin, who had been the choreographer at one of the great clubs that was now in ruins, or they must have been torn down. And I asked her what happened to Idlewild, and she said, integration and the credit card. And so it was sort of one of those ghosts of desegregation, and it brings, you know, just being there and talking to these people, bring up questions about what did the African American community lose, you know, the sort of melancholy with the progress of desegregation, and, you know, what were the gains.
Who were or are Calvin and Patricia Cormier?
They were the two people who befriended me. I mean, again, I had no idea what I was going to find in Idlewild. I sort of drove into town late at night, and it's very, you know, rural, and I had no idea where I was going, where I was going to stay, and I ran up on this store, this little mom and pop shop, and the Cormiers were there. They had moved in from California, and before that they were both from, he was from Texas, she was from Indiana, and they befriended me and sort of got me settled and introduced me to people, so I was very grateful for them.
What did you learn from them?
Well, they had this almost pioneering dream, and which was sort of pregnant among many of the residents there, to put Idlewild back on the map. I mean, most people my generation, I dare say, never heard of Idlewild, and the very concept of a black resort is almost anachronistic insofar as you know, young professionals can literally go in practically anywhere they want to, and so there was this idea of rekindling a certain pride in this area, and they were very committed toward reinvesting in it, and very emotionally invested in that place.
What chances do you give of that returning to the old days?
Well, I found throughout my travels that this sort of emotion, and I think it's more than nostalgia, is very strong, and that people are looking back to the things that black folk had built during a period of segregation, to see that there were some strengths in them and some positive elements, and that people are looking at ways to reconstruct some of these positive institutions. I mean, very much in the way that a lot of our historically black colleges have remained intact.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town on the coast of North Carolina called Chinquapin.
What's it like?
Well, now that I'm gone, there are about 279 people left. It's very rural. Right now, the main industry is hog farming. When I was growing up, it was tobacco farming and soybeans.
What did your parents do?
Well, I was brought up actually by my great aunt, and she was a kindergarten teacher. But I was surrounded by infinitely large extended family, great aunts, great uncles, cousins galore.
Why were you brought up by your great aunt?
Well, my mother and father were not married. I was my father's father was a fairly successful small businessman, and he offered, because my mother was, you know, a fairly poor woman in Brooklyn, New York, where I was born, and my grandfather offered to have me brought up, and so I was sent down to stay with him, and my great aunt sort of took a shine to me, and I went and stayed on the family farm, which is where she lived, and when I was 3, her husband died, and my grandfather suggested I remain there on the farm with her to keep her company.
Do you know where your mother and father are today?
Yes.
Are you in touch with them?
Yes, I am. I am very much.
So what do you think of all this, and, you know, years later, and what do they think of you?
I venture to say they're fairly proud of me. I mean, I'm closer to my father. He lives in North Carolina. My mother's in New York. We don't speak as often, but yes, my father, I believe, is fairly happy.
But did you ever have a discussion about, they say anything like, we wish we'd have raised you, or were they comfortable you being raised by your aunt?
Well, I mean, my situation I don't think is anomalous. I think a lot of young black men wind up in this situation. And one of the things I confront in the book is how most black folk, and I think if we're really honest about it, most Americans are raised by extended families. And there's a particular strength in that because you gain from not just two people, but from a multitude of people. I mean, there's a particular rootedness, I think, in knowing your grandparents. I knew my my great-grandparents, two of my great-grandparents. And, you know, so and we're surrounded by a lot of older folk. So I had a head start in many ways, I think, on people who only knew one generation before them.
What kind of a student were you in high school?
Well, I mean, not to sound self-aggrandizing or anything, but I was fairly studious. I was also something I think as what they would call nowadays a geek or nerd. And actually, when I went to Chapel Hill, I went as a physics major.
Where'd you get your interest in it?
I don't really know. Because growing up in a rural area like that, I didn't know many engineers or scientists. I think it was my interest in science fiction. There was a nuclear power plant down at Wilmington, not too far from us, and so, that probably crept into my imagination. And also, when I was going to high school, elementary school, we'd just gone to the moon, and we were switching to the metric system, and so there was a lot of science talk in the air. So I think, I just picked it up.
But you are a Trekkie.
Definitely.
How did you become a follower of Star Trek?
Well, I think as most people who sort of fall under Gene Roddenberry's vision do. Those initial reruns. I mean, I don't remember it when I was 5 in 1968. Certainly wouldn't have stood to watch it. But through the reruns, through high school, Kirk and Spock and all that sort of thing fascinated me. And as I say, had an interest in science fiction, but Star Trek in particular. I mean, my friend Richard, to whom the book is dedicated, was a huge Star Trek fan. I mean, this is a man who was, dean's listed every semester, Master of Divinity, and he was sort of fascinated by how the ethics were played out, and how in science fiction you can get to the heart of things in a certain way. I mean, the human element in a fresh way without dredging up a lot of cliches.
Where do you live now, by the way?
Right now, I'm a visiting writer in residence at Memphis University of Memphis. Yes.
When did you first know that you liked writing?
As I say, in high school, I was writing science fiction.
In school itself?
Yeah, well, it was something I just did. I never thought of it as a profession or even a trade. I just sort of did it. And
did you ever have a point where a teacher came up and said, "Randall, this is good"?
Actually, my teachers were fairly critical of my writing up to a point. It really was in college when I started taking it a little more seriously. And I mean, again, I've been writing very, pitiful stories, and I fell under the tutorship of one Max Steele, who was sort of ran the writing program at Chapel Hill for a long time, and he challenged a lot of my ideas about taste and source material, and he sort of knew about my background and sort of said, well, there haven't been a lot of people coming out of places like where you've been coming out of, and you should really sort of think about seriously approaching this as fiction. And so the more I read African-American writers in particular, Japanese writers, I don't know why I'm so hyped on Japanese literature, I started taking writing more seriously, and so I sort of abandoned the science by my senior year and sort of cast my lot in.
Senator Harriet Elizabeth Byrd, Cheyenne, Wyoming.
5th generation Wyoming state senator, African-American woman, good Catholic. I had a very interesting conversation with her about growing up in Cheyenne and what it was like to be black in Wyoming.
What did she tell you?
Well, she had a fairly active life. I mean, she'd been a school teacher for many, many years, and that's how she became very active politically. Her father, I think Roan Bird, not Bird, but had been, a high school and college football star, and he'd also been very active politically. I mean, it's a very inspiring and but bittersweet interview in many ways. I mean, she talks about the discrimination she sees going on among Native Americans as well as black folk out west. And she tells a very moving story about a very good friend of hers, Ruby, when she was a child, who was Japanese, and how Ruby and her family were put in a concentration camp during World War II. And how, I mean, that sort of, her friend never forgave this country for that experience. So, I mean, it was a very interesting interview.
How does this, is she still a senator?
No, she's retired now.
How does she feel about the United States today?
She was very hopeful. She was very hopeful. I remember her saying at one point that because she had been on a lot of commissions and had done a lot of traveling, and when she went to India, and saw the difference, her response was, "We got to go back and make America better." I mean, she's a very pragmatic, very compassionate woman, and she was a Democrat, but many of her views might be construed as conservative, actually, and but at base, what she was most interested in, and I think this came from her being a teacher, was putting compassion back into politics.
Barney Ford.
Barney Ford, and I think her. I mean, I sort of read a paragraph perhaps about Barney Ford in my research, but she was very keen on Barney Ford and led me to do more research. Barney Ford was one of these remarkable men during the Reconstruction era who was a escaped slave who went out west and during one of the gold rushes in Colorado and found one of these huge lodes. Well, of course, he was run off of it, but that didn't stop him. He sort of went and made another fortune down in Nicaragua doing catering, came back up to YN and Colorado, and built two of the finest hotels out there, went on to become, I believe, the first African-American in the Colorado legislature, was very active in abolitionist movements and getting people out of the East, out West, sponsored a lot of people, and just sort of, they call him the Black Baron at one point.
Died in 1926.
Yes.
But in that same area where you're talking about Barney Ford, you say, I was stumbling upon more and more of these extraordinary people who also happen to be black. Montana's Stagecoach Mary, California's Biddy Mason, Henry Adams of Kansas, Robert Smalls of South Carolina, Edwin McCabe in Oklahoma. Do you know more about each of those?
Well, I'm learning more and more about each of those. I mean,
how did you find them though? What were the circumstances when each of these names popped up in front of you?
Well, to be sure, I mean, I didn't have to do a lot of traveling to find them because they're all there, hidden very carefully in the library. It just took, the incentive to find them.
Who's Stagecoach Mary? Montana's Stagecoach Mary.
She was sort of this enormous woman who, was, I mean, you think about the images you see in cowboy pictures. I mean, this woman sort of, I think, at one point killed a man with one blow to the head. She was sort of this intrepid messenger and deliverer of goods. And so, this is a larger-than-life figure out of history.
All these are black folks?
Yeah, all the ones I mentioned.
California's Biddy Mason.
She was a laundry woman who went on to become one of the largest landowners in California, around Los Angeles, in fact.
Henry Adams of Kansas.
Henry Adams of Kansas, I can't tell you right now.
Robert Smalls of South Carolina.
Robert Smalls, famous for having liberated or gotten a Confederate ship during the Revolutionary War. It was a literate man who had been held as a slave and sort of snuck it through Confederate lines up to Union held territory and sort of freed himself. And he went on to become, I believe, a state senator.
I did. I must say, when I was reading your book, I was wondering how you would remember all these people, even on a book tour. How you remember all these?
Well, I remember all the people I interviewed, to be sure. I mean, there's been like characters in my head for a great many years.
There are a lot of quotes. There are full pages of quotes in here in a big book. How did you do the actual interview?
I used a tape recorder for accuracy. I took a lot of handwritten notes as well.
And have you kept all those?
Yes. I'm debating now exactly what to do with this electromagnetic archive.
There are no pictures in the book.
No. I tried to take pictures, but I discovered early on that I'm a horrible photographer. So I'm actually going to start taking photography classes. It would have been great to have had some, but it would all have also made the book.
Before I ask you about some more of the characters in your book, what were your conclusions about the United States after you went 75,000 miles in all these communities?
Well, I wound up, I write about, there's a fairly dismal chapter about Chicago. At this point, I'd been, learning all these statistics and talking to people and having all these pessimistic points of views, and I was just sort of depressed and down and out. And I had this interview with a poet and publisher, nationalist, Haki Madhubuti. And he sort of, was an older man, and I sort of, went into him as this bedraggled puppy and sort of with this very pessimistic point of view. And he sort of turned me around. It was one of the more inspiring interviews in the book, and sort of said, well, yes, you can look at all the negative aspects of what's going on in African-American life, but, if you look at the positive, and look at how far folk have come. People of my grandfather's generation have seen the impossible happen. To think that, I would be doing what I'm doing, in fact, for him at this point, is somehow extraordinary. And after, doing all this travel and seeing what has happened, I find it difficult to give myself permission to be pessimistic in a way. One of the guideposts in this book was a book written in 1964 by our great novelist John A. Williams, a book called This Is My Country Too, in which he took a similar trek across the states. But this was, at the height of Jim Crow in the South and in many other parts of the country. And so at times, like in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I compare how conditions were, at the time of my birth to how things were now. And to see what has occurred in that brief amount of time. Even looking full face into the problems that face not only African Americans, but all Americans, I still find it difficult to be negative.
Based on, again, where you went, if you had to make a choice, you didn't have to teach, you didn't have to worry about making money, where would you go live? Where would you get the best treatment?
Oh, my goodness. I think I wax most poetically about the Bay Area, San Francisco. I just came back from there, and I must say, aesthetically, it is one of the most pleasing places in the world, because you just all these multiplicity of skin colors. Just all these cultures stewed together, and it just feels affluent, and the weather is grand. But that being said, there's so many lovely places I did encounter. I fell in love with the desert. I fell in love with Alaska, and there's certain charms to New England that you can't match.
You say you learned that the Alcan Highway was built by blacks?
Yes, this was after I had driven it and sort of had this sort of spiritual moment on Kluane Lake, which is this large glacial a lake up in the Yukon. And I got up there and I found out, and this was after having picked up all these souvenirs and books about the Alcan Highway, which folk don't know is about 1,900 miles long.
Where do you get it? Where do you start driving on it?
In British Columbia, or Edmonton, depending on which way you're going up. But after I got there, I found out that the largest portion of it had been built by African-American men in World War II. This is a feat that people said couldn't be done. It's been compared to the building of the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and one Confederate general, General Buckner, who was the son of a Confederate general, at one point said that black men can't really operate heavy machinery. We can't send them up there. We might leave unwanted racial mixtures and all this sort of thing. But these men, in this inspiring tale, facing all sorts of just geological and engineering problems, built the road up ahead of schedule, and and with great aplomb.
Who was Walter Furness, or who is he? I guess he's still alive.
He at the time was a representative in Alaska. He was a Republican and former airman who had become a bank executive, and was doing very well.
Was he career Air Force?
No, he wasn't. He got out too early to have been career Air Force.
The reason I ask is because another career man who is a black writer, Albert Murray, and I noticed you quote him at great lengths in here.
Yes, well, he did a similar book about the South, and so I looked to him a great many times.
There's another young lady up there by the name of Pennywell.
Yes.
Tell us her story.
Jasmine Pennywell and her brother, Eugene. They were, I think, fourth-generation Alaskans. I actually had an occasion to talk to their grandmother, who was sort of, had lived in Fairbanks for a while, but they were in Anchorage now. She herself was a beautician.
How'd you find her, by the way?
Well, Jasmine's mother had actually published a calendar, which I found in the lower 48. I mean, I'd already planned to go to Alaska, but it was, they sort of gave me a place to go to, a calendar about African Americans in Alaska, particularly Anchorage. Jasmine had this unique experience when she was in middle school. She sort of wrote this essay in which she was sort of condemning what she saw as racist behavior in the school.
How old was she when she wrote this?
I think when she wrote it, she had to have been 12 or 14. And it got published, or sort of mimeographed copies.
I've got it. You want to read a little bit of it?
Oh,
I got
sure.
Here. Let's open to the page there. And just,
okay.
What year did she publish this?
Well, it was distributed, this would have had to have been in 1990, I believe.
It's about 9 years ago.
Right.
How old was she when she did this?
She was in the 7th grade.
And this,
8th grade,
and this was published?
Yeah, well, it was passed around and it finally wound up in, I think, USA Today. Her story did. Racism. I'm a student attending a highly prejudiced school system which has a majority Caucasian atmosphere. I'm an honor roll student of Hanshaw Middle School. I'm very disappointed and concerned by the racism that I deal with each and every day, here at my so-called root of education. For example, the bathroom walls almost every day are covered here and there with white power and white power symbols, with slogans such as blacks are only good for being slaves and whites rule over blacks, as well as labeling the working water fountains whites only and the non-working fountains blacks only. It's extremely difficult to deal with. There is an intense amount of stereotyping as well as hatred floating in the minds and mouths of students and staff of the Hanshaw and Service Anchorage School District. I know by personal experience. I feel that this is absolutely horrible, that the wars that we as a minority, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, etc., fought many years back have to be refought over and over as the days go by. It's sad that people can't have their own opinions and approve and disapprove without discriminating others. It's a shame that there is only 2 times in life that we as people with skin and culture differences are seen as equals. Those 2 important days are our first and last days of your life. For example, when you're born and you're in the nursery, you're not seen as a black or white baby. You're seen as beautiful babies. When you die, you're not seen as a dead black or white man. You're just dead. But I refuse to be a part of the problem. If all I can do is just put the problem in the eyes of the community, in the faces of all the students, principals, and staff, then that is exactly what I'll do. It may not stop during my school years, but one day, with the help of the community and the Almighty God, it will. Because I am fighting for the respect that I have earned and deserve, and most importantly, the rights and education of my children, the children of others, African American and Caucasian, because one day we, tomorrow's dream, will be a part of yesterday's workforce. And that was actually May 1992.
And how many blacks did you find in Anchorage, Alaska?
The percentage of blacks, I believe, is close to 10%.
Higher than you expected?
Yes, and actually is not that far from what it had been before the pipeline, because Alaska's population just exploded to 500,000 after the construction of the pipeline, during the construction of the pipeline.
Did you talk to Jasmine Pennywell about this essay?
Yes, I did.
What did she tell you? What happened to her after it was published?
Well, as you can respect, she got some flack. People tried to repress it. I mean, when I say people, I mean mainly principal and teachers and that sort of thing. I mean, the most remarkable thing is how she just refused to back down from it at all. I mean, she describes one incident, which, cinematography sounds very intimidating and scary with some young white males, and she just sort of, stood up to them and laughed in their face. Nothing, no harm came to her whatsoever.
And in Bangor, Maine, you met a gentleman named Sterling Diamond.
Yes, had been in Maine for generations. He was retired at the time. And I was just very curious to know what life was like in New England. So he just sort of described his growing up. His family had largely actually been from New Brunswick. They came down to Maine. And so he just sort of described the terrain and what it was like to have grown up, what it was like actually, because Maine actually had a larger black population than it has now before World War II. World War II and the collapse of the timber industry sort of led, most people, black and white, to leave Maine to find better conditions.
You said that one of the reasons you wanted to go to Bangor is because of Stephen King.
Yes, I was a huge Stephen King fan.
Did you meet him?
I did not. I didn't try, actually. I just thought it was a moot attempt. But yeah, I wanted to know why there weren't that many black people in his novels. And once I got there, I realized why. There weren't that many black folk in Bangor, Maine.
Well, you say you asked Mr. Diamond what he thought of the term African American, and your quote is, well, when they first started out with black, I kind of had it a little hard. Always been used to saying colored or Negro. I didn't have a problem remembering what to say. He laughed, so I got used to the black. Hell, I think it's wonderful now, but this African American, I don't know why they want to be called African American. I know why, but where's it going to end? First there was colored, then there was Negro, then there was black, now it's African American. How much of that did you find when you talked to?
Well, I mean, I think it was one of the postmodern situations. I mean, at the beginning of the book, I quote Barbara Jean Fields in saying that, we're the only group who are connected to an entire continent, which doesn't mean anything. I mean, Korea is a distinct country with a language. Africa has, hundreds, if not thousands, of languages. So, I mean, African American doesn't really, feel right to a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people are into, using made-up terms and, using retro terms. Like a lot of my contemporaries now use the term Negro, just to sort of get a rise out of people. I did find a lot of people, expressing concern about what that label means. And a lot of people just like black. I mean, they're very comfortable with it.
So when you traveled by did you say a Blazer?
Yes.
Where would you stay?
Mostly in motels. Mostly in motels.
What kind of motels? I mean, that can be expensive.
Yeah, well, Motel 6 became my home away from home. I was very budget conscious. And also, being a young black man out on the road, I didn't want to court, too much, folly. So I didn't want to sort of sleep in the car too much or go camping alone.
What do you mean by court folly?
Well, there's sort of this phenomenon in this country called racism or running afoul, even if you haven't done anything.
Did you find that anywhere?
No, I can't really say that I have. I mean, I tried to avoid it at best. I just didn't put myself in situations where I could be misconstrued as having being trespassing or being someplace I didn't need to be. But I can't say that anything overtly occurred.
Did you have to pay for all these expenses out of your advance?
Yeah, I had my advance and grants and that sort of thing, yes.
So how much in the way of grants were you able to get?
Well, I was very lucky to get a Guggenheim and a Whiting Writers Award and a few other, the Sherwood Anderson Award. So, I mean, we were talking an additional, over, 6 years, $50,000.
How does that work? How do you get grants for something like that?
Some you apply for, and some are, thrust upon you. And I was very happy.
I mean, people hear you're doing this kind of thing and they want you to succeed?
Insofar, yeah. I mean, most of them were just for writing in general.
You went looking for Prince in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Twin Cities.
Yes.
Who is he?
The artist formerly known as Prince. He's this pop musician who I have a great deal of admiration and just love of his music. And I knew it was a fool's adventure to try to find him, because it's very well known that he gives very few interviews, and his is very controversial and that sort of thing.
What would you ask him if you got him?
A lot of his musical influences, probably. I mean, I just find his music to be extraordinarily American, insofar as that it just really merges the diaspora with all sorts of other musical influences. And on top of that, he grew up in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and as a young black man. And so how did that, in essence, lead to this extraordinary, explosive music?
What did you find there?
I found instead, a wealth of information. It's one of the longest chapters in the book. I talked to the deputy police chief, who was retired, but had been a black man. I found this extraordinarily affluent African-American community, as well as politically active, going back to Dred Scott. And before that, this extraordinary labor activist, Nellie Stone Johnson, who'd actually worked with A. Philip Randolph and had been a political mentor to Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. I talked to people who were involved in very dynamic churches there. One of the oldest churches in Minnesota, Pilgrim Baptist. I attended one of the services. Talked to the janitor of that church. He was a very charming fellow. Talked about...
Young man.
Was in his early 20s. Talked about growing up in that community. Minneapolis had a community called St. Paul had a community called Rondo, which was sort of destroyed by the completion of an interstate. And so that, in many ways, it was a touchstone for a lot of people talking about what that community represented. And it was never predominantly black, because the black population of St. Paul and Minneapolis was not huge. I mean, it's growing now tremendously. But, it sort of represented a physical, centralized place. So its destruction, I think, in the early 70s, sort of meant something to people of all walks of life.
Anybody refused to talk to you?
Throughout the entire book, no. One person did, but I found out later that she was very ill. But I didn't... there was a lot of avoidance in Martha's Vineyard. No one actually said no, but they just, they couldn't do it right now. But on the whole, people were very forthcoming, very generous. What would you tell them when you called them? Well, it was hard at times. I'm writing a book about what it means to be black. I mean, I tried to break it down and explain that it was in the tradition of the American travel narrative, and that I was sort of exploring different places in America, especially places that I thought had been overlooked or sort of written out of the equation because a black American presence had not been assumed. Where
in this country do blacks live? I don't know what the word would be, the best, or where did you find the blacks that have done been the most successful financially? Where are they located?
Well, I mean, that becomes very problematic, doesn't it? Because Georgia has always had this very large black middle class, and there's some very wealthy folk there. I don't know if you can isolate a particular place. Chicago has always had a strong entrepreneurial class as well. But I mean, when you talk about the numbers of people in a particular area versus a percentage of black folk who live in the area, I mean, I would actually be interested in that question. I don't know if I could answer it straight off right now.
In Denver, you found the Human Experience bookstore.
Yes.
The Human Experience?
Human.
H-U-E.
H-U-E, as in Hugh.
How did you find it?
Clever play on words. This was a woman named Clara Villarosa, who was, and I think still is, on the board of the National American Book Association. It's a very colorful, powerful woman. She'd been a child psychologist and bank executive at one point. And she decided she wanted to start a bookstore. And of all places, Denver, and on top of that, a bookstore that catered to the African American community, and so she was doing a thriving business at the time, and it had very strong opinions about African American life, particularly men and women, which I just found irresistible.
Dressed in African garb.
She dressed a great deal in African garb. I mean, she was and is very savvy about she's a psychologist, about perception and how people take that as a sense of pride in what she stands for and what she does, and how that sort of rubs off on her business.
Did you take a point of view into these interviews, or did you stay out of it?
I tried very much to stay out of them because, I mean, there's something at once sort of shallow about narrative, travel narratives, and what I wanted to bring by sort of incorporating oral history was, sort of a witness from the place. So when I talked to them about where they grew up, I wanted to let them have their say, and so I tried to stay out of editorializing on their comments about the place. When I stood back and sort of said, well, here I am in Burlington, Vermont, well, I sort of told you what I thought. Because my subjective response to a place is as valid as anyone else's. So there's a mixture between the two.
One of my biggest surprises is that you interviewed the parents of a former Book Notes guest, Nell Irwin Painter.
Yes.
Professor at Princeton, wrote a book on Sojourner Truth. How did you find her parents?
Well, I had been a friend of Nell's. And so I had known them for quite a number of years.
Where do they live?
They live in Oakland, California, where Nell grew up. And Mrs. Irving, who was an author herself, told me the story of the year she and her husband, several years, spent in Ghana. And this is one of those big things in the African community, the sort of going back to Africa. And, just how emotional it was and how that changed them in their perception of America and Africa.
Nell Painter was there with it.
Nell joined them for a while, too, yes.
I know we talked about that.
Yes.
And what did they, after being in Africa, did they have any different conclusions than the other people you talked to about being black and in America?
Well, I mean, I think they had a deeper appreciation for what the entire diaspora means and that whole experience is. I mean, they, realized that there were tremendous cultural differences between Africa and America. And so Ms. Painter and Mrs. Irving and Mr. Irving, were very careful to point out the things that they shared with Africans, how difficult, culturally it is to be united, and yet, sort of how rewarding it was to actually get to know African culture. I mean, I think at one point, Mrs. Irving studied Ga, and sort of adopted the garb of the Ghanaian women and that sort of thing. So I mean, it was a very expanding experience. And then coming back, I mean, it just taught them a lot of things about America that they wouldn't have seen. I mean, perspectives. And for a long time, she set out to educate people about Africa.
Before this program's over, I've got to ask you about 5 movies a day.
It can be done, and I have done it. I am a movie addict, yes.
5 in one day?
Yes, I have a friend who was there with me, so I have a witness.
Why movies?
Why movies? Because I'm addicted to narrative. I mean, before this, I wrote, 2 books of fiction, and I'm back into fiction. And, I just have to have a narrative hit. I have to see about characters and plot and that sort of thing, and it's just entrancing.
What do you see in the movies, the way black people are portrayed?
It's very troubling. I mean, one of the people I interview is Charles Burnett, the great MacArthur Award-winning filmmaker, and he gets into it very deeply and eloquently. There's just not a lot of representation. I mean, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, there was what seemed to be an explosion of young black filmmakers, which is sort of even that, which wasn't that great, has sort of receded. Not a lot of black folk acting, but I mean, there's more than just Sidney Poitier now, which is a good thing, and we have a number of black actresses who are working. But the movie industry, the media, including radio, television as a whole, I think has a lot of expanding to do, not just for black folk, but Native Americans and Latinos. But I mean, that's an interesting challenge for us all.
Edith Jackson in Las Vegas.
Very contentious. I mean, I actually had fun arguing with her. She worked for a literacy program in the library in Las Vegas.
Can I read a little bit of what she said?
Please.
She said, our own worst enemy. I think we all I think we are all, I'll start it again, our own worst enemy. I think we are all the time. That's not, I guess, not as smooth as I would like it. Because white people, from what I've seen, do not represent the big of a problem. I tell my boyfriend the same thing because he's so bent on what white people have done. They haven't done that much. We've built America. They have not done that much. We are still looking for somebody to take care of us. We are still looking for somebody to answer for our own sins. Now, that's really been my experience. My father built his house. The white man couldn't stop him from building no house. How could the white man stop him from building the house? If you're going to build a house, you know. We swam in our lake free of charge. We didn't have to pay to swim or pay to have a pool. Why? Because my father and his family bought all the land around the lake, and she goes on.
Yes. I think it's indicative of, you know, a constant debate among black folk. And I don't want to make it too dialectical because I think it's actually more complex than that. But, you know, the question of are the problems that are afoot in the black community caused by internal or external problems? How much can the black community achieve through, you know, pulling itself up by its bootstraps, self-reliance, you know, self-empowerment, you know, just going out and doing it? And how much of it is limited, you know, where is that, you know, glass ceiling or the actual barrier? How much is some higher power through conspiracy or collusion manipulating the lives of black folk, or just by sheer neglect and keeping them outside of the system, or causing detriment to the African American community? So I think, I mean, it's a healthy debate, and as you can see from Ms. Jackson, some people have some very strong opinions about it, and it doesn't make either of the points of view wrong, too. I mean, as you know, Fitzgerald said, you know, intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in your head at the same time and still function. So,
who's Mary Ellen Pleasant?
Probably of all those Renaissance figures, you know, just my hero, my girl. She was this very mysterious woman, came out to California in I think the 1870s, who is reputed to have, you know, had all sorts of real estate. Some of it may have been bordello, some of it may have not. She became very wealthy. It is rumored, but never proven, that she actually funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. She was a tremendous employer out in the San Francisco area. And this was when San Francisco was a very dangerous town. She funded runaway slaves. She actually, some of the early landmark civil rights cases in California, she funded. And then near the end of her life, things became even more bizarre. She was sort of connected to a very wealthy senator or state senator from California, and was taken to court, and so it just becomes, you know, this saga. But as a figure, I mean, she's just inspirational and just formidable.
$30, 643 pages for your book. Where did you write it?
Wrote it all over the world. I actually, you know, I was in North Carolina. After I did the initial traveling, I did some there. Went to New York, where I'd been living for 13 years.
What were you doing in New York?
Well, I taught at Columbia and Sarah Lawrence College. I was for a year at the university. I'm sorry, at the American Academy in Rome, the Rome Prize. So that was where the bulk of it was actually completed. And Oxford, Mississippi, where I was a writer in residence. So I've toted around a lot of papers for a lot of years.
Faulkner does come up in your book. He used to live there in Oxford, Mississippi.
Yes.
Does his writing have any impact on you at all?
Well, as a Southern writer, I mean, I sort of write mostly about North Carolina and what that means. And I think Flannery O'Connor said it best when she said, nobody wants to be stalled on the train tracks when the Dixie Special comes barreling through. I mean, his sort of influence is hard to ignore when you're dealing in that old territory.
Did you make new friends in this endeavor that you still are in touch with?
Oh yes, many. And the event of the book coming out just sort of helped me rekindle and reconnect with a lot of people. I mean, the woman I spoke with earlier, Nellie Stone Johnson, the labor activist, was in her 80s when I interviewed her, and I'd been writing to her, but it hadn't getting any return correspondence. So, you know, I sort of feared the worst. And I was in St. Paul 2 weeks ago, and at 94, she was there in the audience. So I was happy to see her again. So a lot of people I had been in touch with, and I'm back in touch with a lot more.
How long was the book tour?
Over a month.
How many places did you go?
Officially, there were 10 cities, but more are coming up.
And who was more interested in the book? Or when you look at your crowds and all that, what was the makeup, black and white?
So much depends on what city I was in. St. Paul was fairly integrated, which I was happy to see. Atlanta was all, black. I'm interested in the response myself because people are taking out of it different things. White readers and black readers, and then there's people I had not even thought about, like Native Americans, and particularly people of mixed heritage.
Let me ask you just a couple of last questions. What do you want the black audience to take out of this from reading it?
I would hope it contributes to broadening the debate, but most importantly, the definition of what we talk about when we talk about race and identity. I think we have to get away from a lot of stereotypes, especially among young black folk who think that, black folk don't do this, black folk don't do that, who buy into a certain anti-intellectual stance and think that all black folk are poor.
What do you want the white audience to take away from it?
Just the same thing. Just the same thing. I mean, I think what Martin Luther King said in the 60s, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, still holds true, and that we still need to, we can all stand to get to know each other a lot better.
This is the book, and the cover shows, as we talked earlier, a photograph that no one knows where this picture was taken. It's Everywhere America, Walking on Water by Randall Kenan, our guest. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.